146 BC, the third and final year of the siege. From the hills overlooking Carthage, Roman consul Scipio Aemilianus watched smoke rise from the greatest city in the western Mediterranean. For 3 years, his legions had surrounded these walls. For 3 years, the Carthaginians had defied Rome's demand for surrender. Now, in the spring of 146 BC, the end had finally come. But what Scipio was about to unleash would go beyond military victory. It would become the most complete destruction of a city in ancient history, an act so thorough that Carthage would cease to exist not just as a political entity, but as a place erased from the earth with such systematic brutality that its very location would be debated by historians for centuries. This is the story of how Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, it annihilated it. The relationship between Rome and Carthage had been defined by war for over a century. 3 conflicts, known as the Punic Wars, had transformed the Mediterranean world. The first war, lasting from 264 to 241 BC, had been fought primarily over Sicily. Rome, traditionally a land power, had built its first major navy to challenge Carthaginian naval supremacy. Against all odds, the Romans had prevailed, forcing Carthage to abandon Sicily and pay massive reparations. The second war, from 218 to 201 BC, nearly destroyed Rome. Hannibal Barca, perhaps the greatest military commander of the ancient world, had led his army, including war elephants, over the Alps into Italy. For 15 years he had ravaged the Italian peninsula, inflicting catastrophic defeats on Roman armies. At Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal had annihilated a Roman force of 80,000 men in a single day, the worst defeat in Roman military history. The Roman Senate, receiving reports of the slaughter, had forbidden public mourning because too many families had lost sons, fathers, and brothers. But Rome had refused to surrender. Instead, they had adapted, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal while attacking Carthaginian territories in Spain and North Africa. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, had defeated Carthaginian forces in Spain and then invaded North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio had defeated Hannibal, ending the war and reducing Carthage to a subordinate state, stripped of its empire, its navy, and its independence in foreign policy. The peace terms had been deliberately harsh. Carthage was forbidden from waging war without Roman permission, reduced to its immediate territory in North Africa, and forced to pay 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years. The once mighty naval power was limited to just 10 warships. Rome had effectively neutered Carthage as a military threat, but they had left it alive, a wealthy trading city that continued to prosper despite its political restrictions. For 50 years, Carthage had lived under these terms. The city had rebuilt its economy, its merchants trading across the Mediterranean. The war indemnity was paid in full by 152 BC, ahead of schedule, demonstrating Carthage's continued commercial vitality. The city's walls, which had survived Scipio Africanus's siege, still stood, massive fortifications that made Carthage one of the most defensible cities in the ancient world. But in Rome, a faction had been growing that believed Carthage's very existence remained a threat. Leading this faction was Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, a senator who had fought in the Second Punic War. Cato had become obsessed with Carthage, viewing its continued prosperity as dangerous to Roman security. He famously ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. To modern ears, this sounds like paranoid warmongering, but to Romans who had lived through Hannibal's invasion, who had lost family members at Cannae or Trebia or Lake Trasimene, Carthage represented an existential trauma. As long as Carthage existed, it could theoretically rise again, rebuild its military power, and threaten Rome once more. The only way to guarantee security, Cato argued, was complete elimination. In 151 BC, Carthage provided Rome with a pretext. The Numidian king Massinissa, a Roman ally, had been steadily encroaching on Carthaginian territory for years. When Carthage finally raised an army to defend itself without Roman permission, they violated the peace treaty from 201 BC. The army was defeated by Massinissa, but Rome now had its justification. The Roman Senate declared war in 149 BC, beginning what would become known as the Third Punic War. The war aims were explicit from the beginning. The Roman envoys demanded that Carthage surrender all weapons and armour, which the Carthaginians did, handing over 200,000 sets of armour and 2,000 catapults. Then the Romans revealed their true demand. The population of Carthage must abandon their city and relocate at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea that had made them wealthy. Carthage itself would be destroyed. The Carthaginian response was defiant. The city's leaders knew that Carthage without access to the sea was no longer Carthage. Their entire civilization was built on maritime trade. The council made a fateful decision. They would resist. The city's gates were closed, the walls manned, and a desperate defence organised. Carthage had no army, no weapons, and faced the full might of Roman legions, but they chose to fight anyway. The Carthaginians performed miracles of improvisation. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings for hastily constructed bows. The city's temples and public buildings were stripped of metal to forge weapons. According to the ancient historian Appian, the Carthaginians manufactured 300 swords, 500 spears, and 1,000 catapult bolts daily in workshops that had been commercial enterprises just weeks earlier. Slaves were freed and armed. Every able-bodied person, regardless of age or sex, was mobilized for the city's defense. The initial Roman assault led by consul Manius Manilius was a disaster. The Roman forces, expecting an easy victory over a disarmed city, found themselves facing determined resistance. Carthage's fortifications were among the most formidable in the ancient world. The walls were triple-layered in many sections, reaching heights of 45 feet, with internal barracks that could house 24,000 soldiers and 4,000 horses. The harbour installations included a circular naval harbour connected to a rectangular merchant harbour, both protected by walls and a massive chain that could be raised to block entry. For 2 years, Roman forces besieged the city without success. The Carthaginians held out, supplied by blockade runners who slipped past Roman naval patrols. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated but never collapsed entirely. The city's massive granaries, built into the walls themselves, provided food. Wells and cisterns provided water. The Romans, meanwhile, suffered from disease in their camps, poor supply lines, and the humiliation of failing to conquer a supposedly defenceless city. In Rome, the continued resistance became a political embarrassment. In 147 BC, the Senate took the extraordinary step of appointing Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal, as consul despite him being below the minimum age requirement. The message was clear. The Scipio family had defeated Carthage before. They would finish the job now. Scipio Aemilianus arrived in Africa with reinforcements and immediately changed Roman tactics. He recognized that direct assault on Carthage's walls was futile. Instead, he would strangle the city, cutting off all supplies until starvation forced surrender. He constructed a massive mole across the harbour mouth, a stone causeway that blocked the main entrance to the port. The Romans built forts at key positions around the city, creating a siege line that prevented any supplies from reaching the defenders. The Carthaginians responded by excavating a new channel from their inner harbour directly to the sea, a massive engineering project completed in secret. When the work was finished, they surprised the Romans by sailing out with a hastily constructed fleet of 50 warships. For a moment it seemed Carthage might break the siege, but the crews were inexperienced, the ships improvised, and the Roman fleet, though caught off guard, was too powerful. The Carthaginian sortie ended in defeat, and the new channel was soon blockaded like the old one. By the winter of 147 BC, conditions inside Carthage had become desperate. Food stocks were running low, disease was spreading. The population, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside, was beginning to starve, but still they refused to surrender. The memory of Rome's initial demand that they abandon their city entirely made surrender seem pointless. If Rome intended to destroy Carthage anyway, they might as well die, defending their homes. In the spring of 146 BC, Scipio launched his final assault. Roman forces stormed the harbour district under cover of darkness, establishing a foothold inside the city's defences. What followed was not a battle but an extermination. House by house, street by street, the Romans advanced through Carthage. The fighting was savage, conducted room by room in the cramped quarters of the city's residential districts. The Roman historian Appian writing 2 centuries later based on eyewitness accounts, described the horror. The Romans, moving through narrow streets, encountered resistance from every building. Carthaginians threw tiles and stones from rooftops. They fought from windows and doorways. The Romans responded by setting fires, burning entire blocks to force defenders into the open. The streets became clogged with bodies, rubble, and the wounded who could not escape the flames. The fighting continued for 6 days and nights. The Romans advanced up the sloping streets toward the Byrsa, the citadel hill that dominated the city. Scipio ordered his men to clear the streets by any means necessary. Roman soldiers began systematically demolishing buildings, pushing the rubble into the streets to create paths for their advance. Bodies, both living and dead, were buried in this rubble. Appian recorded that the screams of those trapped under the debris haunted the Roman soldiers. As the Romans reached the higher ground of the Byrsa, they encountered the Temple of Eschmun, where the last defenders had gathered. Approximately 50,000 Carthaginians, mostly civilians, had taken refuge in the temple complex. Among them was Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, the Carthaginian commander who had led the defence. According to Roman accounts, Hasdrubal emerged from the temple with olive branches, prostrated himself before Scipio, and begged for his life. Scipio granted Hasdrubal mercy, but offered no terms for the remaining Carthaginians in the temple. The refugees, realizing there would be no negotiated surrender, chose mass suicide over Roman captivity. They set fire to the temple. As flames consumed the building, Hasdrubal's wife, who had refused to surrender with her husband, appeared on the temple steps with their 2 children. In full view of both armies, she cursed Hasdrubal for his cowardice, then jumped into the flames with her children. The spectacle affected even the Romans. Polybius, the Greek historian who was present with Scipio during the siege, recorded that Scipio wept at the sight. When Polybius asked why he was crying at the moment of his greatest triumph, Scipio replied with a quote from Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." Scipio, according to Polybius, saw in Carthage's destruction a premonition of Rome's own eventual fall. But sentiment did not prevent systematic destruction. Approximately 50,000 surviving Carthaginians were enslaved, the entire population sold at auction to dealers who had followed the army specifically for this purpose. The Roman Senate, receiving news of the city's fall, issued orders that went beyond typical conquest. Carthage was to be obliterated, not just defeated. What followed was unprecedented in ancient warfare. The Roman legions, following Senate orders, began demolishing Carthage building by building. This was not casual destruction, or the looting that typically followed ancient sieges. This was systematic annihilation conducted with engineering precision. The massive defensive walls, which had withstood Roman siege engines for 3 years, were pulled down stone by stone. The harbour installations, architectural marvels that had taken generations to build, were smashed into rubble. Public buildings, temples, homes, and shops were reduced to foundations. The most persistent legend of Carthage's destruction claims that Romans salted the earth so nothing could grow there again. This story, repeated in countless history books, is almost certainly false. It first appears in historical sources nearly 2,000 years after the event. No contemporary or near-contemporary source mentions salt. Moreover, the amount of salt required to permanently sterilize the large area of Carthage would have been economically impossible. Salt was a valuable commodity in the ancient world, sometimes worth its weight in silver. Using it to symbolically curse land would have been an absurd extravagance. The truth required no embellishment. The physical destruction was thorough enough. Archaeological evidence from Carthage shows a distinct destruction layer from this period. Walls were toppled, floors torn up, and buildings reduced to foundations. The Roman demolition was so complete that later rebuilding, when Romans did eventually found a new city on the site, had to begin almost from bedrock. But the destruction wasn't just physical. Rome declared the site of Carthage to be cursed ground, forbidden for habitation. A ritual of devotio was performed, cursing anyone who tried to rebuild the city. Boundary stones were placed marking the forbidden zone. For a generation, the site was abandoned, visited only by scavengers picking through the ruins for anything of value the Romans had missed. The surrounding territory, once the agricultural heartland of Carthage, was reorganized as the Roman province of Africa. Roman settlers, mostly veterans of the African campaigns, were given land grants in the region. The Carthaginian language and culture, which had dominated North Africa for centuries, began to disappear as Roman law, Latin language, and Italian customs replaced them. Within 2 generations, Punic Carthage existed only in memory and in Roman historical accounts. The strategic calculation behind Carthage's destruction was brutal, but logical from Rome's perspective. Every previous attempt to neutralize Carthage through treaty limitations had failed to provide lasting security. After the First Punic War, Carthage had rebuilt and produced Hannibal. After the Second Punic War, despite harsh restrictions, Carthage had remained wealthy enough to be perceived as threatening. Roman strategists concluded that as long as the city existed in any form, it represented a potential future threat. The only permanent solution was elimination. The psychological impact on other Mediterranean powers was immediate and profound. Rome's willingness to completely destroy a major city sent a clear message. Resistance would not just be defeated but punished with annihilation. Cities that might have considered challenging Roman expansion saw what had happened to Carthage and reconsidered. The same year Carthage fell, Rome also destroyed Corinth in Greece following a revolt, burning the city and enslaving its population. The message was coordinated and deliberate. The age of negotiated settlements and limited warfare was over. Rome would accept nothing less than absolute submission. The completeness of Carthage's destruction created a peculiar historical problem. So little remained that later historians debated the city's exact extent and layout. When Julius Caesar proposed founding a new city on the site a century later, surveyors had difficulty determining where the old city had actually stood. The harbour installations, once the most advanced in the Mediterranean, were so thoroughly demolished that their original design had to be reconstructed from literary descriptions rather than archaeological remains. Yet despite physical destruction, the memory of Carthage persisted in Roman consciousness. Cato's famous phrase, "Carthago delenda est," became shorthand for the complete elimination of threats. Roman poets like Virgil, writing a century after Carthage's fall, still reference the Punic Wars as the defining conflict of Roman history. In the Aeneid, Virgil imagined Dido, queen of Carthage, cursing Rome and prophesying eternal conflict between the two peoples, even though by Virgil's time Carthage had been Roman for generations. The irony is that Rome eventually rebuilt Carthage. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar ordered the establishment of a colony on the site, though he was assassinated before the plan could be executed. His successor, Augustus, completed the project in 29 BC. The new city, Colonia Julia Carthago, was explicitly Roman in design and culture, but it rapidly became one of the most important cities in the empire. By the 2nd century AD, Roman Carthage was the 3rd largest city in the Roman world, after Rome itself and Alexandria, with a population approaching 500,000. This new Carthage bore little resemblance to its Punic predecessor except location. It was a Roman city, speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, governed by Roman law. The Punic language survived in the countryside for centuries but disappeared from urban use within a generation of the Roman founding. The cultural continuity that had defined Carthaginian civilization for 600 years was permanently severed. The agricultural prosperity of North Africa, which had made Carthage rich, now enriched Rome. The province of Africa became the breadbasket of the empire, shipping grain to feed Rome's growing population. The harbours that Carthage had built for its merchant fleets were eventually reconstructed and expanded to handle the massive grain shipments. The trade routes Carthaginian merchants had established were taken over by Roman and Italian traders. Everything that had made Carthage wealthy was transferred to Rome. Modern historians debate whether Carthage's destruction was necessary or justified. Some argue it was a strategic necessity, that Rome could never be secure while a major rival existed just across the Mediterranean. Others contend it was imperial overreach, the destruction of a city that posed no real military threat in 146 BC. The debate parallels modern discussions about preemptive warfare and the ethics of regime change. What's undeniable is the effectiveness of Rome's solution. After Carthage's destruction, no major power would challenge Rome in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The Punic threat that had terrified Romans for over 100 years was permanently eliminated. Whether this justified the methods used remains a question of moral philosophy rather than historical fact. The archaeological record of Punic Carthage is frustratingly incomplete, precisely because of how thoroughly it was destroyed. What we know of Carthaginian culture, religion, and daily life comes primarily from Roman sources, written by their enemies. Carthaginian literature, if it existed in substantial quantity, was lost entirely. No Carthaginian historical accounts survived. The Punic language is preserved only in fragmentary inscriptions and in references within Roman and Greek texts. This creates a fundamental imbalance in how we understand the Punic Wars. We have Livy's detailed history of Rome's perspective. We have Polybius, a Greek writing under Roman patronage. We have nothing comparable from Carthage itself. The story of how Rome burned Carthage off the map is told entirely by those who did the burning. Carthage cannot speak for itself because Rome ensured it would never speak again. The totality of this cultural erasure is what makes Carthage's destruction unique in ancient history. Cities were frequently conquered, sacked, and destroyed in the ancient world, but they usually rebuilt, often on the same site, preserving some continuity of culture and memory. Carthage was different. When Rome finished with it in 146 BC, nothing remained but ruins and memories in Roman minds. The culture, language, religion, and people of Punic Carthage simply ceased to exist as a distinct entity. In military terms, the siege itself was remarkable for its duration and difficulty. The fact that an essentially disarmed city held out for 3 years against Roman legions demonstrates both the quality of Carthage's fortifications and the determination of its defenders. Modern military historians note that Carthage's resistance, improvising weapons and organising defence with no standing army, represents one of history's most impressive examples of urban warfare conducted by civilians. The improvised Carthaginian navy, built in secret and launched as a surprise, showed remarkable ingenuity even in defeat. That civilians could construct 50 warships in secret within a besieged city demonstrated engineering capabilities that Romans respected even as they destroyed them. Scipio himself reportedly admired Carthaginian resilience, even while systematically eliminating it. The final assault through the city streets pioneered urban combat tactics that Roman armies would refine in later campaigns. Fighting house to house, clearing buildings systematically, using fire to force defenders from cover, these became standard Roman procedures in urban warfare. The techniques learned destroying Carthage would be employed against Jerusalem in 70 AD and numerous other rebellious cities throughout Roman history. The slave markets that followed Carthage's fall represented a massive influx of human property into the Roman economy. 50,000 enslaved Carthaginians represented a significant percentage of the total Roman slave population at that time. Many were educated and skilled, having been merchants, artisans, and professionals in Carthage's sophisticated urban economy. These slaves, distributed throughout the Mediterranean, carried fragments of Carthaginian culture with them, though they could never reconstitute it as a living civilization. The psychological impact on survivors must have been devastating. To be Carthaginian in 147 BC was to be a citizen of a major Mediterranean power, heir to 600 years of history and culture. By 145 BC, to be Carthaginian was to be a slave or refugee, your city erased, your culture dying, your identity itself becoming a historical footnote. Few peoples have experienced such complete collective destruction in such a short time. Roman writers occasionally expressed ambivalence about what had been done. Scipio's tears, whether historical or rhetorical invention, suggest Romans understood the magnitude of what they had accomplished and its implications. If Rome could do this to Carthage, could someone eventually do it to Rome? This anxiety would persist throughout Roman history, manifesting in various forms as the empire faced its own challenges and eventual decline. The economic impact on the Mediterranean world was substantial. Carthage had been a major trading power, its merchants competing with Greek and Italian traders throughout the region. Its destruction eliminated this competition, allowing Roman and Italian merchants to dominate Western Mediterranean trade routes. The wealth that had flowed to Carthage was redirected to Rome, contributing to the economic transformation that would eventually strain Roman political institutions and contribute to the Republic's collapse. The question of whether Carthage's destruction prevented future conflicts is ultimately unanswerable. We cannot know what would have happened had Carthage been allowed to survive as a subordinate ally or peaceful neighbour. What we know is what did happen. Rome eliminated a rival so completely that no possibility of resurgence remained. In this limited sense, the strategy succeeded. Carthage never threatened Rome again because Carthage no longer existed. The moral legacy is more complicated. Rome's destruction of Carthage established a precedent for total warfare that would be invoked repeatedly throughout history. When later powers justified the complete destruction of enemy nations, they often referenced Rome's example. The concept that some threats must be eliminated entirely rather than merely defeated has Roman roots, and Carthage is the paradigmatic case. For Carthage itself, the story ends in spring 146 BC with flames consuming the Temple of Eshmun and Roman soldiers systematically demolishing what those flames spared. The great rival that had nearly destroyed Rome at Cannae, that had challenged Roman expansion for over a century, that had built an empire spanning from Libya to Spain, was reduced to rubble and memories in Roman minds. The city that had launched Hannibal, that had terrorized Roman nightmares for generations, that had represented the greatest threat Rome ever faced, simply ceased to exist. When Scipio Aemilianus stood in the ruins, watching his soldiers complete their work of destruction, he reportedly quoted Homer again, reflecting on the impermanence of power and the certainty that all great cities eventually fall. But in that moment, surveying the devastation his legions had wrought, Scipio had accomplished something unprecedented. He had not just defeated a city or conquered a nation. He had erased a civilization from existence, leaving nothing but ashes, scattered stones, and an empty place where Carthage had been. The day Rome burned Carthage off the map, the ancient world learned that Roman power was absolute, and Roman vengeance was total. For nearly a century, Carthage had been Rome's equal, its rival, and its greatest fear. After 146 BC, Carthage was nothing but a name, a cautionary tale, and a memory of what happens when Rome decides a threat must not just be defeated but obliterated from history itself. The mechanics of Carthage's destruction reveal as much about Roman military organization as about their ruthlessness. The systematic demolition required planning, logistics, and sustained effort that went far beyond the chaos of conquest. After the last defenders fell and the temple fires burned out, Scipio organized his legions into specialized demolition teams, each assigned specific sectors of the city to reduce to rubble. Roman engineers, the same men who had built siege works and fortifications, now applied their expertise to destruction. They identified load-bearing walls and structural elements, determining the most efficient methods to collapse buildings. Battering rams that had failed against Carthage's outer defences were now turned inward, smashing through walls that no longer had defenders. The work was methodical, almost bureaucratic in its thoroughness. The harbour installations presented particular challenges. Carthage's circular military harbour, an architectural marvel that had housed 220 warships under a covered roof, supported by massive columns, required weeks to demolish properly. Roman engineers studied the structure, identifying weak points where controlled demolition would bring down the roof without requiring them to remove every stone individually. They succeeded, collapsing the entire structure into the harbour basin, filling it with rubble that would make reconstruction nearly impossible. The commercial harbour, with its sophisticated dock facilities and warehouses, received similar treatment. The massive stone quays, built to handle centuries of Mediterranean trade, were broken apart with iron wedges and fire. Romans would heat stone with fire, then douse it with cold water, causing thermal shock that fractured even the largest blocks. This technique, time-consuming but effective, allowed them to destroy structures that would have taken months to demolish through pure physical labour. The defensive walls, which had withstood Roman siege engines for 3 years, proved the most difficult obstacle. These weren't simple stone barriers but sophisticated fortifications with multiple layers, internal passages, and structural redundancy. Roman demolition crews worked section by section, undermining foundations, collapsing upper sections, and breaking apart the rubble to ensure no future defenders could use even damaged walls for protection. Contemporary accounts mention the sound of destruction echoing across the ruins for months, the crash of collapsing buildings, the rhythmic hammering of soldiers breaking stone, the grinding of timber being torn apart, all created a constant auditory reminder of Carthage's obliteration. Locals in nearby settlements, including those who had supported Rome during the siege, reported that the noise was audible from miles away on calm days. The Roman soldiers performing this work were not specialists but ordinary legionaries. The same men who had fought through Carthage's streets now laboured as demolition workers, a task they apparently resented. Several ancient sources mention disciplinary problems among the troops during the demolition phase. Soldiers who had eagerly fought for plunder and glory found manual demolition work tedious and degrading. Scipio had to maintain strict discipline to ensure the work continued. The looting that accompanied destruction was systematic rather than chaotic. Unlike typical sacks where soldiers grabbed whatever they could carry, Roman authorities organised the collection of valuables. Everything of worth, from gold and silver to bronze fittings and iron tools, was catalogued and allocated. The wealthiest items went to the Roman treasury. Lesser valuables were distributed to soldiers based on rank. Even the stone and timber from demolished buildings had value and were sorted for potential use elsewhere. Carthaginian art and religious objects received special attention. Scipio ordered that any Greek artworks identified among the plunder be returned to their cities of origin, a propaganda move designed to portray Rome as a liberator of Greek culture from Carthaginian control. Statues, paintings, and decorated temple furnishings that Greek cities claimed had been stolen during Carthaginian conquests were ceremonially returned, generating goodwill throughout the Greek world while simultaneously demonstrating Rome's cultural sophistication. The Carthaginian gods received no such respect. The temples of Baal-Hamon and Tanit, the principal deities of Carthage, were demolished with particular thoroughness. Sacred precincts where Carthaginians had worshipped for centuries were desecrated and destroyed. Roman soldiers, many of whom were superstitious about foreign gods, reportedly performed this work reluctantly, fearing divine retribution. But Scipio's orders were clear, and the temples fell like everything else. The Tophet, Carthage's controversial sacred precinct, where children may have been sacrificed according to Roman sources, though this remains disputed by modern scholars, was obliterated completely. Whether the Roman accounts of child sacrifice were propaganda or truth, Romans believed them and destroyed the site with particular vehemence. The urns and stelae marking the burials were smashed, the sacred precinct filled with rubble, the very ground torn up to erase any trace of what Romans considered barbaric practices. As demolition progressed, a practical problem emerged. Where should all the rubble go? Carthage was a large city, and demolishing it created mountains of broken stone, shattered timber, and pulverized brick. Roman soldiers simply pushed much of it into the streets, creating artificial hills of debris that buried the city's infrastructure. Other rubble was dumped into the harbours, deliberately filling the basins to prevent their future use. Some was carted away for use in Roman construction projects in the province. The agricultural hinterland of Carthage, which had made the city wealthy, required different treatment. This land was too valuable to destroy, as it would form the economic foundation of the new Roman province. But Carthaginian estates, farms and villages dotting the countryside were systematically cleared. Buildings were destroyed, property seized, and the land redistributed to Roman settlers. The Carthaginian rural aristocracy, those who hadn't died in the siege, found themselves dispossessed and displaced. The transformation of this landscape was rapid and deliberate. Roman surveyors mapped the territory using centuriation, a grid system that divided land into regular squares for distribution to veterans and colonists. This Roman geometric order replaced the organic pattern of Carthaginian settlement, literally reshaping the landscape to reflect Roman, rather than Punic concepts of spatial organization. Within a generation, even the pattern of roads and field boundaries was Roman. The fate of Carthaginian knowledge and literature represents one of history's great cultural losses. Carthage had libraries, though we know little about their contents. The city's literate culture had produced historical works, agricultural treatises, navigational texts, and religious literature. Virtually all of it disappeared. Some texts may have been deliberately destroyed, others were likely lost in the fires that consumed the city. A few may have been taken to Rome, but if so, they didn't survive in Roman libraries. One exception deserves mention. Mago's agricultural treatise, a comprehensive work on farming techniques developed in North Africa, was considered valuable enough that the Roman Senate ordered it translated into Latin. This 28-book work became a standard reference in Roman agricultural literature, though the original Punic text has been lost. That this practical manual survived when historical and literary works did not suggest Roman priorities. Useful knowledge was preserved. Cultural expression was expendable, The human geography of the region transformed as completely as the physical landscape. The 50,000 Carthaginians enslaved in the city's fall represented only a fraction of the population affected. Throughout the former Carthaginian territory, people who had identified as Punic found themselves reclassified as provincial subjects of Rome. The Carthaginian identity, which had unified diverse populations through language, culture, and commerce, began fracturing immediately. Some Carthaginians fled beyond Roman control to Numidian kingdoms or more distant settlements. These refugees carried their culture with them, but lacked the critical mass to maintain it as a living civilization. Punic communities persisted in some coastal cities like Hadrumetum and Leptis Magna, but they were shadows of the cosmopolitan culture that had centered on Carthage. Without the capital city, without political autonomy, Punic culture began its long decline into extinction. The psychological warfare inherent in Carthage's destruction extended beyond the immediate victims. Throughout the Mediterranean world, cities that had enjoyed independence or had resisted Roman expansion reconsidered their positions. The message was unmistakable. Rome was capable of and willing to completely destroy even the greatest cities. Negotiated settlements and diplomatic arrangements could be revoked at Roman discretion. Total submission was the only guarantee of survival. This lesson was reinforced by Rome's simultaneous destruction of Corinth in Greece. The coordination was deliberate. In the same year, 146 BC, Rome eliminated its primary rival in the west and made an example of a major Greek city that had led resistance in the east. The twin destructions announced a new era in Mediterranean politics. The age of independent city-states competing for regional dominance was over. The age of Roman hegemony had begun. Greek intellectuals responded with shock and criticism. Polybius, despite being embedded with Scipio and generally pro-Roman, expressed discomfort with the totality of Carthage's destruction. Other Greek writers were more direct in their condemnation. They saw in Rome's actions a barbarism that contradicted Roman claims to be bringing civilization to the Mediterranean. The debate over whether Rome's conduct was justified or excessive began immediately and has never entirely ceased. Within Rome itself, reactions were complex. The common people celebrated Carthage's destruction as final victory in the long struggle with their most dangerous enemy. Veterans of the African campaigns, men who had spent years besieging the city, felt vindicated. The aristocracy, however, had more nuanced responses. Some, like Scipio himself, seemed troubled by the precedent they had set. Others celebrated the expansion of Roman power and the elimination of commercial rivals. Cato the Elder, the man who had most vehemently advocated for Carthage's destruction, died in 149 BC, just as the Third Punic War began. He didn't live to see his obsession fulfilled, but his ideological victory was complete. Rome had adopted his uncompromising vision. Threats would be eliminated, not managed. Rivals would be destroyed, not contained. This approach would characterize Roman imperial policy for centuries. The economic consequences of Carthage's elimination rippled through Mediterranean commerce. Carthaginian merchant networks, built over centuries, collapsed overnight. The sophisticated trading relationships connecting North Africa with Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and the eastern Mediterranean were disrupted. Roman and Italian merchants rushed to fill the vacuum, but they lacked the established relationships and local knowledge that Carthaginian traders had developed over generations. Mediterranean trade patterns took decades to fully recover. The specialized products for which Carthage had been famous disappeared from markets. Carthaginian purple dye, textiles, metalwork, and other luxury goods ceased production. The craftsmen who had created them were dead, enslaved, or dispersed. Their techniques, often closely guarded trade secrets passed through families, were lost. Some products were eventually reproduced elsewhere, but the specific Carthaginian quality and style vanished forever. North African agricultural exports, however, increased under Roman control. The fertile grain lands that had fed Carthage now fed Rome directly. Italian landlords, many of them senators and equestrians, acquired vast estates in the new province. These latifundia, large slave-worked plantations, produced grain on an industrial scale. By the 1st century BC, North Africa had become so important to Rome's food supply that controlling the province was essential to controlling Rome itself. The demographic transformation of the region was profound. Italian settlers, mostly veterans but also merchants and administrators, established communities throughout the former Carthaginian territory. They brought Roman customs, Latin language, and Italian agricultural techniques. Indigenous Berber populations, who had lived alongside Carthaginians for centuries, now found themselves subjects of a new imperial power with different cultural expectations. Some Berber kingdoms had allied with Rome against Carthage, expecting to benefit from their rival's destruction. Massinissa, the Numidian king whose encroachments had helped provoke the Third Punic War, gained territory from Carthage's fall. But these kingdoms soon learned that alliance with Rome meant subordination to Rome. Within decades, Numidia itself would be reduced to a client state, its independence as thoroughly eliminated as Carthage's had been. The question of whether alternative outcomes were possible haunts historical analysis. Could Carthage have negotiated better terms? Could they have surrendered earlier and preserved something of their city and culture? The answer is probably no. Rome's demand that Carthaginians abandon their coastal city and relocate inland was designed to be unacceptable. The Senate wanted war and wanted destruction. Carthage's defiance gave them their pretext, but any response would likely have been deemed insufficient. Some historians argue Carthage could have survived by completely abandoning political and military ambitions decades earlier, becoming purely a commercial city under Roman protection. But this ignores the reality that Carthage's wealth and strategic location made it threatening regardless of intent. As long as the city existed with its fortifications, harbours and population, Rome would perceive a potential threat. The logic of preventive war admitted no compromise. The archaeological investigation of Carthage began in earnest in the 19th century, when European colonial powers controlled North Africa. French archaeologists working in Tunisia located the site of ancient Carthage and began excavation. What they found confirmed ancient accounts of systematic destruction. The archaeological layer corresponding to 146 BC shows evidence of intense fire, deliberate demolition, and abandonment. Building foundations had been dug out, walls toppled, and the rubble spread to prevent reconstruction. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed details the ancient sources missed. Analysis of burnt materials shows that different parts of the city burned at different times, consistent with deliberate fire setting rather than accidental conflagration. The pattern of rubble distribution indicates systematic demolition work rather than random destruction. Even the filled harbours show organised dumping rather than gradual silting. Every detail confirms that Rome's destruction of Carthage was methodical and thorough. The topography of the site has changed significantly since antiquity, partly through natural processes but mainly through human action. The harbour basins, once Carthage's defining features, were so thoroughly filled and built over that their exact configuration remained uncertain until underwater archaeology in the 1970s finally revealed their layout. The city walls, which ancient sources described as among the greatest in the world, survived only as scattered foundation stones. Most were carted away centuries ago for use in other construction. What makes Carthage's archaeological record particularly frustrating is the overlay of later Roman construction. When Augustus founded Colonia Julia Carthago on the site, Roman builders used the ruins of Punic Carthage as a quarry and foundation. They dug through earlier levels, destroying stratification. They reused Punic stones in Roman buildings. They built directly over Punic remains without regard for preservation. The result is that Punic Carthage survives only in fragments, making comprehensive reconstruction of the city impossible. The Punic language survived longer than the city. In rural North Africa, Berber populations who had adopted Punic as a lingua franca continued speaking it for centuries. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century AD, nearly 500 years after Carthage's destruction, mentioned that Punic was still spoken by African peasants. But it was a dying language, lacking prestige or official status, preserved only in isolated communities increasingly dominated by Latin. By the 6th century it had disappeared even from rural areas. A few Punic inscriptions from the Roman period survive, mostly religious dedications or funerary monuments. They show a language in decline, increasingly influenced by Latin vocabulary and grammar. The latest reliably dated Punic inscription comes from the 3rd century AD, over 400 years after the city's destruction. These final texts, carved by people who still identified with Carthaginian heritage, despite living in a thoroughly Roman world, represent the last gasps of a dying culture. The legacy of Carthage's destruction influenced Roman behaviour toward other enemies. The debate over how to treat defeated foes became central to Roman political discourse. Hardliners cited Carthage as proof that complete destruction was the only safe policy toward major enemies. Moderates argued that such extremism was unnecessary and counterproductive, creating resentment and resistance. This tension played out repeatedly as Rome expanded. When Julius Caesar defeated his rival Pompey in Rome's civil war, some urged him to pursue Carthaginian thoroughness against his enemies. Caesar instead chose clemency, pardoning opponents and seeking reconciliation. This clemency policy, though politically motivated, represented a deliberate rejection of the Carthage model. Caesar recognized that total destruction worked against external enemies, but not in civil conflicts where the destroyed population was Roman itself. The Carthage precedent also influenced how later enemies approached conflict with Rome. The knowledge that Rome could and would completely destroy resistant cities encouraged some to surrender quickly. Others, particularly those with nothing to lose, fought with the desperation of people who knew defeat meant extinction. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, where Jewish defenders resisted to the last despite hopeless odds, shows this dynamic. Like Carthage, they knew surrender might mean the end of their nation. The transformation of North Africa from Punic to Roman was completed by the spread of Roman urban culture. New cities were founded throughout the province, built in Roman style with forums, basilicas, amphitheatres, and temples to Roman gods. These cities attracted settlers from Italy and encouraged indigenous populations to adopt Roman culture. By the 1st century AD, North Africa was producing Latin literature, contributing senators to Rome, and fully participating in Roman civilization. The speed of this cultural transformation was remarkable. Within 3 generations of Carthage's destruction, North Africa was indistinguishably Roman in its urban centres. The Punic heritage survived only in personal names, local customs in rural areas, and occasional Punic phrases that had entered local Latin. The sophisticated urban civilization that had been Carthage was replaced by an equally sophisticated but entirely different Roman one. This raises uncomfortable questions about cultural genocide. Rome didn't systematically murder every Carthaginian, but they destroyed the cultural framework that made Carthaginian identity possible. Without their capital city, without political autonomy, without their language having official status, without their religious institutions, what did it mean to be Carthaginian? The identity became impossible to maintain and gradually faded into irrelevance. Modern scholars debate whether Rome's treatment of Carthage constituted genocide in the contemporary sense of the term. The physical destruction of the city and enslavement of survivors certainly involved massive violence. The erasure of Carthaginian culture was deliberate policy, but the Roman goal was elimination of a political and military rival, not extermination of an ethnic group. Carthaginians who adopted Roman culture could integrate into the empire. The distinction matters for understanding Roman imperial ideology, even if it provided little comfort to those whose culture was destroyed. The psychological impact on Roman consciousness was lasting. Hannibal remained Rome's nightmare enemy for centuries after his death. Children were frightened into obedience with threats that Hannibal was coming. Political enemies were accused of being new Hannibals, traitors ready to destroy Rome from within. The Second Punic War became Rome's war defining national trauma, and Carthage's final destruction represented closure on that trauma, however brutal the means. This cultural memory shaped Roman identity. Rome was the city that had survived Hannibal, that had refused to surrender after Cannae, that had eventually destroyed its greatest enemy so thoroughly that enemy ceased to exist. This narrative of resilience and ultimate triumph became central to how Romans understood themselves. They were the people who could not be defeated, who would pursue revenge for generations if necessary, who would accept nothing less than total victory. The specific date when Carthage ceased to be inhabited after 146 BC is uncertain. The cursing of the site and prohibition against rebuilding was serious, but enforcement was imperfect. Squatters and scavengers likely inhabited the ruins intermittently. The excellent harbour location and fertile hinterland made complete abandonment unlikely. But for roughly a century, Carthage as a city did not exist. The site was ruins, memories, and a symbol of Roman power. When Caesar proposed refounding Carthage in 44 BC, Exactly a century after its destruction, he faced opposition from traditionalists who considered the site cursed. But practical considerations prevailed. The location was too valuable to leave unused. The agricultural wealth of the region required an urban centre for administration and commerce, and a century was long enough for the trauma of the Punic Wars to fade into history rather than living memory. Caesar's assassination prevented him from executing the plan, but Augustus completed it 15 years later. The new Carthage was Roman in every respect except location. Its street plan followed Roman patterns, its public buildings were Roman in style, its founding colonists were Roman veterans, Latin was its language from the beginning. The only connection to Punic Carthage was geography, and perhaps a certain defiant pride in having risen from total destruction. But this was Roman defiance, not Punic. The success of Roman Carthage vindicated the strategic value of the location. Within decades, it was among the empire's largest cities. By the 2nd century AD, it was a major centre of commerce, learning and culture. The harbour facilities, rebuilt larger than their Punic predecessors, handled grain ships supplying Rome itself. The city produced emperors, philosophers, and saints. It became more important to Rome than Punic Carthage had ever been to its Phoenician founders. This irony was not lost on ancient commentators. Rome had destroyed Carthage to eliminate a rival, but then rebuilt it as a jewel of the empire. The wealth and strategic importance that made Carthage threatening when independent made it valuable when controlled. The systematic destruction of 146 BC was necessary, from Rome's perspective, to ensure that when Carthage was rebuilt, it would be Roman rather than Punic. The agricultural treatise of Mago, the one significant Punic text that survived in translation, influenced Roman farming practices for centuries. Techniques developed in North Africa for growing grain, olives, and vines were adopted throughout the Roman Mediterranean. Ironically, Carthaginian agricultural knowledge contributed more to Roman prosperity than centuries of Carthaginian commercial competition ever had. Knowledge could be extracted and used even after its creators were eliminated. The complete destruction of Carthage established a template that Rome would occasionally but not frequently follow. Most conquered enemies were incorporated into the empire rather than eliminated, but the option of total destruction remained available for enemies Rome deemed too dangerous to preserve in any form. The threat was rarely executed but always present, a final sanction that encouraged submission and discouraged sustained resistance. In 146 BC, when the last fires burned out and the demolition teams completed their work, Carthage had been transformed from a living city into an empty space. The greatest rival Rome ever faced in the Western Mediterranean had been reduced to scattered stones, ash, and memories held by survivors scattered in slavery throughout the Roman world. The day Rome burned Carthage off the map marked not just the end of a city, but the extinction of a civilization that had flourished for 6 centuries. The completeness of that extinction remains startling even across the millennia. Cities have been destroyed throughout history, but few have been so thoroughly eliminated that their very existence became difficult for later generations to reconstruct. Carthage survives in history because Rome recorded its destruction, but Carthage itself, its own voice, its own understanding of its culture and achievements, is silent. Rome ensured that Carthage would be remembered, but remembered only as Rome chose to remember it, as an enemy, as a threat, as a warning, and ultimately as a victim of the most systematic urban destruction the ancient world had ever witnessed.